Thank you for holding up into the afternoon. Maybe the freezing temperatures will keep us all awake for the next couple of sessions. I wanted to thank the organizers, especially Barb and Paula, but also Rochelle and Marina, for all the work you put into this. It's really turned out to be a fabulous event, and I'm sure will continue to be so, so thank you very much. And I also wanted to say what an honor it is to be on this panel with Jennifer, our moderator, but also with Juan, who I've known for a long time but have admired, and Helen, who I'm meeting for the first time but who have admired her work as the symbol of civil society and their action, unfortunately, based on victimization, but still very important action in terms of bringing about justice. Barb started the session off yesterday talking about reconsidering the processes in light of what we know now and what truth was told. And I'm going to pick up those couple of themes in my accounting of the Guatemalan Truth Commission, but I'm going to talk about a kind of truth that was told that wasn't part of the official truth, wasn't maybe meant to be told. But before I do that, I want to say a little bit about what, in light of what we know now, how our truth commissions assessed. And many of you know that I've worked on quantitative studies of the impact of truth commissions and also trials and amnesty laws. And what we found in our statistical analysis is that truth commissions aren't statistically significant when it comes to reducing human rights violations and strengthening democracy. Maybe they were never intended to be that. That's not necessarily the goal. But in order to study whether transitional justice works, the question that Helen left us with at the end, this truth commissions haven't proven to help in these two goals. Our first study showed that they were actually negative for human rights, but in updating that study and including more time and also more truth commissions, we're not saying that they're negative for, we're not finding that they're negative for human rights violations, but they're still not having that positive effect. What they have, what we do argue is they still play a role, and particularly in exposing the truth about the past, of constructing an official narrative, even when that narrative is often contested. And it also attempts to address victims' needs for the basic rights of truth, justice, at least restorative justice, reparations when it's in the recommendations, which is not always the case. But we're not sure that they get to this institutional reform, even when it is in the recommendations, as Juan mentioned in his presentation, and therefore limited in terms of guarantees of non-recurrence. Part of the reason, and I think this gets back to some of the presentations we've already had today, is the failure to get at these root causes of the violence, and particularly deeply embedded systems of inequalities. So what we've started to do is to try and look at whether there's some part of transitional justice that can, using the standard mechanisms of transitional justice, truth commissions, and trials in particular, whether there is a way to get at these root causes. And so we began a project on what we're calling corporate accountability and transitional justice. And by corporate, we really mean economic actors, individual economic actors, business associations, and businesses, domestic as well as multinational. We defined corporate complicity, or the economic actors' complicity, in these four ways: joint criminal enterprise, during dictatorships and armed conflict. So this includes, in our database, on-site detention centers. It also includes involvement of certain economic actors in the disappearance, murder, torture, and it includes land grabs. We also include financing human rights violations, and this could be the role of banks in sanction busting, but it also is the funding of death squads. We which we can talk about later. And we look at labor violations, the slave labor in particular, as well as the engagement of illegal enterprises that are based on violent kinds of forms of trade, like drug trafficking or conflict minerals, the blood diamonds case. So we started this project not really expecting to find a whole lot in traditional transitional justice mechanisms, but you can see here what we did find. From the very beginning of transitional justice with the attempts at accountability for violations during the Holocaust, we found over 300 companies and also individual business people involved in those violations, meaning judicial action was brought against them in some form. I'm not going to go into all of the details about that. It would be too long for my 15 minutes. I'm going to focus on the Truth Commission's cases. As you see, we also have over 300 companies that have been named in Truth Commissions. We also look at judicial actions. We have 138, and we keep finding more. I just found some yesterday on the plane ride here. So we have to constantly update those judicial actions, again, for businesses or individuals who were involved in human rights violations during dictatorships and in armed conflict. And we've also done some analysis of the justice and peace cases in Colombia, meaning the paramilitaries that were put on trial, and in the judge's decision on these cases, they mention businesses that they were working with in carrying out human rights violations. And we have over 400 of those cases. You can ask me about any of those in the Q&A or during our break, but I wanted to focus on the Truth Commissions today. As I mentioned, we have over 300 economic actors that were named in Truth Commissions. This is interesting because very few of the Truth Commissions, in fact, we've only found one, the Liberian one, that actually has in their mandate the look for corporate complicity in the human rights violations. There's some that include economic crimes without necessarily having any human rights violations, and we only count the ones in which they're linked. They could be in economic crimes and human rights violation, but they have to have that human rights violation to be included in our database. Despite not having this in the mandate of Truth Commissions, over half of the Truth Commissions have not only mentioned the role of businesses in the violations, but have named names of companies. So that's why we have 300 economic actors who are named. I've listed the Truth Commissions that have these, that have named names, and I have one question about El Salvador because we haven't been able to find a searchable file. If anybody has one of the Truth Commission report, please send it to us. But what I did use was the National Security Archive naming of the Miami Six. And I've been searching for their names, and I have been finding a few of those. So I think we're going to add El Salvador to this list of Truth Commissions. The important thing to mention here about Guatemala is that it had the second highest number of companies named in the Truth Commission. But nobody knows that, right? I mean, very few people would say Guatemala, they've gone after businesses that were involved in the violence. The highest number is Brazil with 123, and the second highest is Guatemala with 45 companies or individuals named. After that, it's Liberia with 34 and South Africa with 30. These cases are mainly companies and some individuals and business associations. They're mainly national companies rather than multinationals or subsidiaries of multinationals. They're primarily in agriculture, rural farms in particular, and they mainly involve direct action, meaning arbitrary detention, extradition, killing, homicide, torture, kidnapping, and enforced disappearance. But there's also a role for financing that repression in more indirect action. The bulk of the victims are workers. When we could tell that they were unionized, we have about 29% of unionized. We put as non-unionized if it wasn't identified. The other thing that's important to say, though, is that there are no recommendations regarding looking at this, maybe not a phenomenon, at this problem of concentration of wealth in the country and the role that economic actors played in the violence. That's not surprising. Most truth commissions did not include recommendations. The Brazilian one, well, three, the Brazilian, the Liberian, and the Ecuadorian truth commissions called for further investigation to determine if there were criminal acts. But most either had very vague recommendations about improving institutions with a human rights objective, including businesses, and the South African one that calls for voluntary reparations by businesses. The others didn't include anything. These are the companies and the individual actors that were named, the 45 that we have. I should also say that Guatemala has had very little follow-up in terms of those companies named, not necessarily rare for what we're finding in the truth commissions. There are 5 cases that have been brought where there's been some kind of judicial action. So far, no decisions. There's the one case that's pending is the Alien Torts Claim Act against one of the Coca-Cola subsidiary, and the 2 national firms. One is a state firm in electricity, the INDE, and then Zimeri is another textile and gun manufacturing company that's been brought up on trial, but they're not, they haven't advanced through the system yet. So in this sense, Guatemala, you could say, I think this gets back to Helen's point, is, yeah, there's some positives in terms of naming this responsibility, even maybe the beginnings of some judicial action, but very little has been done. And Guatemala could be said, even though it's one of the highest in terms of truth commissions, in terms of judicial action, Latin America as a whole is a protagonist in taking some of these companies to court for their judicial action, but Guatemala doesn't meet the highest cases in terms of doing that. Colombia is Argentina is the highest in terms of bringing judicial action. Colombia follows second, but Colombia has more convictions, and so it shows up in this one in terms of outcome. You'll also see that most of these cases in the Americas have been brought in domestic courts, whereas in other regions of the world, they're mainly in foreign courts. We only found one international case, which is the Rwandan media case in the ICTR. Okay. The other thing that's interesting about Latin America and where Guatemala does fit is this high number of pending cases. Even though the pending case in Guatemala is in a foreign court, in the U.S. courts, this notion that the only region with pending cases that we've been able to find is the Americas, which means there is increasing interest in thinking about how to hold these companies responsible for the role that they played in the past violence. Okay, so what do we make of this? We have developed a framework looking at these cases that there are 2 important factors in terms of holding companies accountable for human rights violations, either in truth commissions or in trials. In other words, the explanation holds for both. One is that there have to be institutional innovators. In truth commissions, because there's no mandate for holding businesses accountable, we need the institutional innovators who are hearing the testimony of individuals and then incorporating this into the final report for them to appear. Without those institutional innovators, commissioners who would just do what the mandate says, these might not appear at all. And in courts, this is even more importantly because there isn't an established international law that can be drawn on, and so the kind of institutional innovation that we're finding taking place in the domestic courts, and again, in Latin America, have been the blending of international human rights law and standard domestic law, like labor law or money laundering law, in which they can avoid statute of limitations requirements because of a crime against humanity. The other key factor for us is civil society involvement. And we, in the Truth Commissions, what we're finding is those commissions that had testimony of victims were much more likely to include the names of companies than those that did not. And so we have to do more digging on this, but we think that that's how this is emerging in the Truth Commission reports, through the testimonies of individuals. And also in the courts, without there being demand for justice for corporate complicity, we wouldn't find the institutional innovators working for justice for groups of victims. We can come back and talk about that more if you'd like. In terms of what we're thinking about, the value of this is that right now, the Truth Commission, our study shows how many Truth Commissions have presented this issue as a kind of restorative justice, at least naming names of companies, but it's still invisible overall. Maybe if we can get some of our work published, we just submitted a manuscript a couple weeks ago for publication, we can start to make this visible, more visible. And it is one way to use transitional justice mechanisms to get at those root causes of concentration of wealth, concentration of power, and impunity that comes with that concentration of wealth and power. So we'd say that the follow-up is really thinking about making this part more consciously part of transitional justice mechanisms. This might bother Pablo, since it might be more concept stretching or mandate stretching that he's opposed to, but because it's one of the ways that transitional justice could get at root causes, we're thinking that it should be included more. And we also think it's a way to get at not just truth, but also justice and reparations, since many of these cases come with civil claims for individuals or settlements, and then holding these economic actors accountable for their role in this process is a way to start to establish that guarantee of non-repetition. Thank you very much.